The morning sun shone brightly over Warren Elementary School as children's laughter filled the playground during recess. It was a typical Tuesday in spring, with flowers blooming around the schoolyard and a gentle breeze, carrying the sounds of joy across the neighborhood. Among the playing children was 5-year-old Sophia Thompson, her dark curly hair tied neatly with yellow ribbons matching her school uniform. Sophia had always been one of the brightest students in her kindergarten class. Her teacher, Ms. Roberts, often praised her for her good behavior and kind heart. That morning, Sophia had even received a gold star for helping clean up after art class. She was still wearing the Helper of the Day badge proudly pinned to her uniform as she headed out for recess. The playground was equipped with 2 swing sets, a slide, and a small climbing frame. Sophia's favorite was always the swings, where she would pretend she could touch the clouds. Today, however, all the swings were occupied. Sarah Miller, a classmate known for being bossy, had been on the same swing for 20 minutes, ignoring the school's 5-minute sharing rule. "Excuse me," Sophia said politely, just as her mother had taught her. "Can I have a turn now? You've been swinging for a long time." Sarah crossed her arms and swung higher. "No, my daddy bought these swings. He told me so." Sophia knew this wasn't true. Her mother, Dr. Thompson, had attended the PTA meeting where they discussed the new playground equipment. She remembered her mom telling her how the whole community had helped buy it. "That's not true," Sophia replied calmly. "These swings are for everyone. Ms. Roberts says we have to share." As Sophia stood waiting patiently, Tommy Chen, another classmate, ran past chasing a ball. He bumped into Sarah's swing, causing her to slip slightly. Though Sarah wasn't hurt, she immediately burst into loud, dramatic tears. Miss Jenny, a new teacher's aide who had only been at the school for 2 weeks, rushed over. Instead of asking what happened or following the school's conflict resolution steps, she panicked at the sight of Sarah's tears. Looking around frantically, she spotted Officer James Miller doing his routine patrol past the school fence. "Officer, officer," Miss Jenny called out, waving her arms. "We need help." Officer Miller was known in the precinct for his quick temper and rigid approach to law enforcement. At 43, he had served on the force for 15 years, but his record was far from perfect. There had been multiple complaints about his aggressive behavior, especially in minority neighborhoods, but they had all been quietly filed away. The officer strode onto the playground, his hand instinctively resting on his belt. The other children fell silent as his heavy boots crunched across the wood chips. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. "What seems to be the problem here?" Miller asked, his voice unnecessarily stern for a situation involving kindergartners. Miss Jenny, still flustered, pointed at Sophia. "There was a fight over the swings. That little girl pushed Sarah." Sophia's eyes widened. "No, I didn't. Tommy accidentally bumped the swing when he was running." Tommy, who had stopped nearby, nodded in agreement. "It was an accident. I was just getting my ball." But Officer Miller wasn't interested in listening to explanations. He had already made up his mind based on his first glance at the situation. Looking down at Sophia, he saw not a scared 5-year-old honor student but what his prejudiced mind wanted to see. Principal Martinez, who had been monitoring recess from her office window, noticed the commotion and quickly headed toward the playground. She could see the situation was rapidly heading in the wrong direction. "Officer Miller," she called out, walking briskly across the playground. "There's no need for police involvement. This is a minor playground dispute that we can handle internally." But Miller raised his hand to silence her, his face set in a stern expression. "Ma'am, please step back. I need to establish authority here. These kids need to learn about consequences." The other children gathered in a circle, watching with frightened expressions as Officer Miller took out his handcuffs. None of them had ever seen anything like this before. Sarah had stopped crying and was now looking confused and scared, realizing her tantrum had caused something much bigger than she intended. What nobody noticed was Maria Rodriguez, a parent volunteer who had been helping organize books in the library. Hearing the commotion, she had stepped outside with her phone already recording. Without attracting attention, she captured every moment of what was about to become a viral video that would change everything. The peaceful spring morning at Warren Elementary was about to turn into a day that would spark national outrage and force a long overdue conversation about police conduct in schools. Officer Miller's next actions would shock everyone present at Warren Elementary that morning. The playground, usually filled with joyful sounds, fell eerily quiet as he pulled out his handcuffs. The metal clinked ominously in the spring air. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Miller commanded Sophia, his voice harsh and cold. The little girl, confused and terrified, began to tremble. Tears welled up in her big brown eyes as she looked around desperately for help. She was wearing her favorite yellow hair ribbons and Helper of the Day badge, standing barely tall enough to reach Officer Miller's waist. But I didn't do anything wrong," Sophia whispered, her voice shaking. Her lower lip quivered as she clutched her small hands together. Principal Martinez tried again to intervene. "Officer Miller, this is completely unnecessary. She's just a kindergartner. Let me handle this situation." Miller turned to the principal, his face red with anger. "Step back, ma'am. I won't tell you again. These kids need to learn respect for law enforcement. No one is above the law." The other children watched in horror as Officer Miller roughly grabbed Sophia's small wrists. The handcuffs were so big they slipped right off her tiny hands, but Miller seemed determined to make them work. He tightened them until they pinched her skin, causing Sophia to cry out in pain. "Mommy," Sophia sobbed, tears now streaming down her face. "I want my mommy." Sarah, the girl who had been on the swing, started crying again, this time from guilt and fear. "She didn't push me. It was an accident. Please stop." Tommy Chen, still holding his ball, ran to get Ms. Roberts from the teacher's lounge. Other children began crying too, frightened by what they were seeing. Miss Jenny, the teacher's aide who had called Officer Miller, stood frozen in shock, realizing her terrible mistake. Maria Rodriguez, the parent volunteer, continued recording everything on her phone. Her hands shook with anger, but she kept the camera steady, knowing this evidence would be crucial. She had already sent a quick text to Dr. Thompson, Sophia's mother, and was quietly narrating everything she saw into the phone's microphone. "The time is 10:47 a.m., she whispered into her phone. "Officer Miller is now attempting to place a crying 5-year-old kindergartner in handcuffs over a simple playground misunderstanding." Principal Martinez pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I need to report an officer who is out of control at Warren Elementary School. He's attempting to arrest a 5-year-old student. This is an emergency." Officer Miller, ignoring everyone around him, began reading Sophia her Miranda rights as if she were a hardened criminal. The absurdity of telling a kindergartner she had the right to remain silent was lost on him. "You have the right to an attorney," he continued, while Sophia hiccuped with sobs. "If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Just then, Ms. Roberts burst through the playground doors, running toward them with Tommy right behind her. Her face showed pure horror at the scene before her. "What in heaven's name is going on here?" she demanded, immediately moving to comfort her terrified student. "Officer Miller, remove those handcuffs immediately." But Miller stood his ground. "This is a police matter now." She assaulted another student. She did not. Several children shouted at once, finding their courage. Tommy bumped the swing by accident. The situation had drawn attention from nearby classrooms. Teachers and students pressed their faces against windows, some taking out their phones to record. The school secretary was on the phone with the police department, reporting Miller's behavior to his superiors. Through her tears, Sophie tried to explain again. I just wanted to turn on the swing," she sobbed. "Mommy says we have to share and be nice." The mention of her mother seemed to fuel Miller's inappropriate response even more. "Your mother needs to teach you about respecting authority," he snapped. What Officer Miller didn't know was that Dr. Thompson's car had just screeched into the school parking lot. Maria's text had reached her during a break between patients, and she had immediately left her medical practice. In less than 10 minutes, she had driven across town, breaking several speed limits herself. As she rushed toward the playground, the sound of her daughter's cries reached her ears. Dr. Thompson's face set in a determined expression. She was about to teach Officer Miller a lesson about authority that he would never forget. The next 10 minutes would not only end Miller's career, but would also become a turning point in the national conversation about policing in schools. Maria Rodriguez had been volunteering at Warren Elementary for 3 years, helping in the library every Tuesday morning. As a former journalist, she knew exactly how important it was to document everything she was seeing. Her steady hands kept her phone camera focused on the unfolding scene, even as her heart raced with anger. "This is completely wrong," she whispered into her phone's microphone, making sure to capture every detail. "Officer Miller has handcuffed a 5-year-old girl. She's wearing a yellow dress with matching ribbons in her hair. She's crying for her mother." The video showed Sophia's small figure trembling as she stood handcuffed on the playground. The Helper of the Day badge, still pinned to her dress, sparkled in the morning sunlight, making the scene even more heartbreaking. Other children could be seen in the background, many of them crying or holding onto their teachers in fear. Maria zoomed in on Officer Miller's name badge and badge number, making sure they were clearly visible in the footage. She also captured the time display on the large school clock mounted on the wall. 10:52 a.m. Every detail would be important later. "I'm going to send this video to every news station in the city," Maria texted her husband, who worked as a tech consultant. "Help me make sure it gets shared everywhere." Just then, Dr. Karen Thompson burst through the playground gates. She was still wearing her white doctor's coat from the hospital, with her stethoscope hanging around her neck. Her face showed a mixture of horror and fierce determination as she took in the scene before her. "What are you doing to my daughter?" Dr. Thompson's voice rang out across the playground. The authority in her tone made even Officer Miller turn around quickly. Maria's camera captured the exact moment Dr. Thompson saw the handcuffs on her daughter's wrists. The mother's expression changed from anger to something much more powerful, a calm, controlled fury that made Officer Miller take a small step backward. "Mommy!" Sophia cried out, trying to run to her mother but stumbling because of the handcuffs. Dr. Thompson caught her daughter, then turned to face Officer Miller. "Remove these handcuffs immediately," she said, her voice steady but filled with controlled anger. "I am Dr. Karen Thompson, Chief of Pediatrics at City General Hospital, and you are traumatizing a kindergartner." Maria zoomed in on Miller's face as he tried to maintain his authority. "Ma'am, your daughter was involved in an assault." "No, she wasn't." Sarah, the girl from the swings, suddenly spoke up. She had stopped crying and stepped forward bravely. "I lied. Sophia didn't do anything wrong. Tommy just bumped the swing by accident when he was running." Maria's camera caught every word, panning between the speakers as more children began telling the truth. Tommy Chen nodded vigorously, still holding his ball. "I was just trying to catch my ball. I didn't mean to bump the swing." Miss Jenny, the teacher's aide who had called Officer Miller, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "This is my fault," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I panicked and called the officer without following proper school procedures. I'm so sorry." Maria made sure to record Principal Martinez calling the police department again, this time speaking with the police chief directly. "Yes, sir, Officer Miller has handcuffed a 5-year-old over a playground misunderstanding. Yes, sir, we have video evidence." The video showed Dr. Thompson examining her daughter's wrists as soon as Miller finally removed the handcuffs. Red marks were visible where the metal had pinched her skin. Maria zoomed in on these marks, knowing they would be important evidence. "This will not go unaddressed," Dr. Thompson announced clearly, looking directly at Officer Miller. "You have just traumatized an entire playground of children. Every parent will know about this." Maria's phone battery showed 20%, but she kept recording. She captured the arrival of 2 more police cars, this time with officers who professionally took statements from everyone present. They spoke gently to the children, showing how police officers should actually behave. Within minutes, Maria's video began uploading to social media. Her husband, true to his tech expertise, helped it spread quickly. By the time the school principal called an emergency assembly to talk to the frightened students, the video had already been viewed thousands of times. The timestamp on Maria's final clip read 11:02 a.m. In just 10 minutes, she had captured enough footage to end Officer Miller's career and start a nationwide conversation about police conduct in schools. Her steady hands and quick thinking had turned a playground incident into a catalyst for change. Later, when asked why she kept recording, Maria would simply say, "Someone had to bear witness. Someone had to make sure the truth was seen. The video of Sophia's arrest spread across social media like wildfire. Within minutes of Maria Rodriguez posting it online, phones throughout the city began buzzing with notifications. Parents started calling each other, sharing the video with mounting anger and disbelief. By 11:15 a.m., just 20 minutes after the incident, local news vans were already pulling up outside Warren Elementary School. Reporter Sarah Chen from Channel 4 News was the first to arrive, her crew quickly setting up their equipment near the school entrance. "We're live outside Warren Elementary," Sarah reported, her voice serious, where earlier this morning, Officer James Miller handcuffed a 5-year-old kindergarten student over a playground misunderstanding. The video of this incident has already reached over 50,000 views. Inside the school, Dr. Thompson was sitting with Sophia in the nurse's office, carefully photographing the red marks on her daughter's wrists. As a doctor, she knew exactly how to document injuries. She spoke softly to her frightened daughter while taking pictures. "You did nothing wrong, sweetheart," she assured Sophia, who was still hiccuping with occasional sobs. "Mommy is going to make sure this never happens to another child." The school nurse, Mrs. Garcia, brought Sophia her favorite teddy bear from her classroom and a cup of warm cocoa. "Dr. Thompson," she said quietly, "there are reporters outside asking to speak with you, and the police chief is on his way." Dr. Thompson nodded, her face determined. She had already made several phone calls of her own, to her lawyer, to the ACLU, and to several other pediatricians who could speak about the psychological impact of such trauma on young children. Meanwhile, in the school office, Principal Martinez was dealing with a flood of incoming calls. Parents were demanding to know if their children were safe. Many wanted to pick up their kids early. The school secretary had to set up a second phone line to handle all the calls. "Yes, Mrs. Johnson, your son is safe," Principal Martinez assured one parent. "We've already removed Officer Miller from the premises. No, you don't need to pick Tommy up early, but you're welcome to if you'd like." Outside in the parking lot, more news vans arrived. Reporters interviewed Maria Rodriguez, who stood calmly explaining what she had witnessed. Her video was playing on tablets and phones all around her as she spoke. "As a mother myself," Maria told the reporters, "I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Officer Miller showed no concern for this child's well-being. He treated a kindergarten playground incident like a major crime." By 11:30 a.m., the police chief himself, Robert Wilson, arrived at the school. Unlike Officer Miller, Chief Wilson had a reputation for community engagement and reform. He walked quickly into the building, his face showing genuine concern. The chief found Dr. Thompson in the nurse's office, where Sophia had finally fallen asleep on a small cot, exhausted from crying. The teddy bear was tucked under her arm, and her yellow hair ribbons were slightly crooked from all the excitement. "Dr. Thompson," Chief Wilson said softly, trying not to wake Sophia, "I want to personally apologize for Officer Miller's actions. This is not how our department treats children, and there will be consequences." Dr. Thompson looked at the chief steadily. "This isn't just about consequences for one officer," she replied. "This is about changing the entire system. My daughter was handcuffed for wanting a turn on the swing." Outside the nurse's office, students were being gathered in the cafeteria for an emergency assembly. Ms. Roberts and other teachers were helping children process what they had seen. Many still seemed scared, especially the kindergartners who had witnessed everything. Social workers and child psychologists were already being called in to help counsel the students. Dr. Thompson's hospital colleagues had volunteered to come speak with the children about dealing with traumatic experiences. By noon, the video had reached national news networks. Phones at the police department's public relations office were ringing constantly. Journalists were digging into Officer Miller's past record, discovering previous complaints that had been ignored. The hashtag Justice for Sophia was trending on social media. Parents across the country were sharing their own stories of police overreach in schools. What had started as a simple playground incident was quickly becoming a national conversation about police reform and children's rights. Dr. Thompson looked at her sleeping daughter and took out her phone. She had already received calls from 3 national morning shows wanting interviews. But first, she needed to make one more call to a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. Her daughter's healing would come before any media appearances. The clock on the nurse's office wall showed it was just barely past noon. In less than 2 hours, a mother's worst nightmare had turned into a movement for change. By early afternoon, the police department's phones wouldn't stop ringing. The receptionist, Linda Martinez, had never seen anything like it in her 15 years on the job. Her switchboard lit up like a Christmas tree, with hundreds of angry citizens demanding action. "Yes, sir, I understand your concern," Linda said for what felt like the 100th time. The chief is already at Warren Elementary dealing with the situation. She wiped sweat from her forehead as another line began blinking. Inside the police station, Officer Miller's body camera footage was being reviewed by Internal Affairs. The footage painted an even worse picture than Maria's viral video. Before approaching Sophia, Miller could be heard muttering under his breath, making several inappropriate comments about teaching these kids a lesson. Detective Sarah Williams, head of Internal Affairs, watched the footage with growing anger. She paused the video and turned to her colleague. "Pull Miller's complete file. I want every complaint ever filed against him on my desk in an hour." In a dusty storage room deep in the station's basement, clerks began digging through old files. What they found was shocking. 15 previous complaints against Officer Miller, all involving excessive force, and most involving minorities. All had been mysteriously marked as resolved without investigation. "Look at these dates," one clerk said to another, pointing at the papers. 3 complaints in just 1 month last year, all swept under the rug. Who authorized this? Meanwhile, at City Hall, Mayor Thompson, no relation to Sophia, called an emergency press conference. The usually calm mayor looked visibly shaken as he faced the crowd of reporters. "What happened at Warren Elementary today is unacceptable," he declared, adjusting his tie nervously. "I've spoken with Chief Wilson, and Officer Miller has been immediately suspended without pay pending investigation." Reporters shouted questions. Is it true Officer Miller had previous complaints? Why was an officer with known issues assigned to school patrol? Will there be changes to police protocols in schools? Back at Warren Elementary, Dr. Thompson sat in Principal Martinez's office, surrounded by child advocacy lawyers who had arrived to offer their services. Her phone kept buzzing with messages of support from other parents and medical professionals. "The hospital board wants to issue a statement," Dr. Thompson told her lawyer, scrolling through her messages. "They're offering to provide free counseling services to any child traumatized by today's events." In the school library, Maria Rodriguez was helping organize a parent meeting for that evening. Her video had now reached over 1 million views. News organizations were offering to buy the footage, but she refused to sell. "This isn't about money," she told them firmly. "This is about justice and protecting our children." The school counselor's office was full of children wanting to talk about what they had seen. Tommy Chen, still holding his ball from recess, spoke quietly about feeling guilty for accidentally bumping the swing. "It wasn't your fault, Tommy," the counselor assured him. "Adults sometimes make big mistakes, and that's what happened today." Sarah, the girl from the swing set, had asked to speak with Sophia. When they met in the counselor's office, she gave Sophia her favorite unicorn sticker collection. "I'm sorry I didn't tell the truth right away," Sarah said, her eyes down. "I was scared, but you were really brave." By 3 p.m., more details about Officer Miller's past began emerging. A retired police sergeant came forward with stories about Miller's aggressive behavior during training. Former colleagues shared incidents they had witnessed but never reported, fearing backlash. The police union, usually quick to defend officers, released an unusual statement. "The actions taken at Warren Elementary today do not reflect proper police procedure or our values. We support a full investigation." Inside the station, Chief Wilson's secretary was organizing files for tomorrow's emergency meeting with the police review board. She found something disturbing. Miller had failed his psychological evaluation 3 years ago, but someone had changed the results in the system. "Chief," she called out, "you need to see this right away." As the afternoon sun began to set, Officer Miller sat alone in his house, watching his career crumble on every news channel. His phone was full of missed calls from reporters and angry messages from former colleagues. The gravity of his actions was finally sinking in. But this was just the beginning. Tomorrow's revelations would shake the entire police department to its core, and Officer Miller's actions would become a case study in police reform across the nation. The emergency town hall meeting that evening was packed. Every seat in the city council chamber was filled. with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The air conditioning struggled to keep up with the crowd's angry energy. Mayor Thompson stood at the podium, his forehead shining with sweat under the bright lights. Behind him sat Police Chief Wilson, Principal Martinez, and several city council members. The clock showed 7:00 p.m. sharp when he began speaking. "Tonight, we're here to address the incident at Warren Elementary," the mayor began, but was immediately interrupted by shouts from the crowd. "Address? It was assault on a child." One parent yelled. "Show us the body cam footage," another demanded. Dr. Karen Thompson sat in the front row, her daughter Sophia now safely at home with relatives. She had changed from her doctor's coat into a formal blue suit, ready to address the council. Beside her sat Maria Rodriguez, her phone containing the viral video placed carefully on her lap. Chief Wilson stepped up to the podium next. "Earlier today, we placed Officer Miller on immediate administrative leave. But as we've investigated further, we've uncovered disturbing information that requires immediate action." The chief clicked a button, and a screen lowered behind him. What appeared shocked everyone in the room, a spreadsheet showing dozens of complaints against Officer Miller over the past 5 years. Excessive force against a teenage boy at a basketball court. Aggressive behavior during a routine traffic stop with a minority driver. Unnecessary handcuffing of an elderly woman at a neighborhood park. The list went on and on. From the audience, people began standing up to share their own stories. Mrs. Jenkins, a grandmother, rose shakily to her feet. "Last summer, Officer Miller threatened to arrest my grandson for selling lemonade without a permit. He was 7 years old." Mr. Rodriguez, no relation to Maria, stood next. "2 months ago, Miller drew his weapon during my son's high school baseball game because the kids were arguing about a call. They were just children." Each story added to the growing tension in the room. Chief Wilson's face grew darker with each testimony. Detective Sarah Williams from Internal Affairs then took the podium. She held up a thick folder. "We discovered that someone in the department has been systematically burying complaints against Officer Miller. This goes beyond one bad officer. This is a failure of the entire system." The crowd murmured angrily as she explained how Miller's psychological evaluation had been altered, how complaints had been marked resolved without investigation, and how his behavior had been ignored by supervisors. Principal Martinez spoke next, her voice trembling with emotion. "Today, I watched a 5-year-old student, the child who won the Helper of the Day badge, being treated like a criminal. This cannot happen again, not in our schools, not anywhere." Dr. Thompson finally stood to address the council. The room fell silent as she walked to the podium, carrying a medical file. "These are the photographs of my daughter's wrists," she said, holding up several clear images. "As a doctor, I can tell you these marks show excessive force. As a mother, I can tell you this is unforgivable." The photos were displayed on the screen, showing angry red marks where the handcuffs had been. Several people in the audience gasped. City Council member Janet Chen stood up. "I move for an immediate vote to terminate Officer Miller's employment and launch a full investigation into everyone who covered up his previous actions." The vote was unanimous. Chief Wilson then announced additional measures: mandatory psychological evaluations for all officers, new training protocols for dealing with minors, and the creation of a civilian oversight board for police conduct. As the meeting continued, Officer Miller sat in his home watching it all unfold on local news. His phone buzzed with a text from the department. "Your services are terminated effective immediately. Turn in your badge and gun tomorrow at 9 a.m. The town hall meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end, the city had fired Officer Miller, suspended 3 supervisors pending investigation, approved funding for new police training programs, established a committee to review all past complaints, created new guidelines for police interaction with minors." As people left the meeting, Maria Rodriguez's phone buzzed. The video had now reached 5 million views. National news networks were planning special reports. What happened to little Sophia Thompson was about to change police departments across the country. But the most important change had already happened. Officer Miller's career in law enforcement was officially over. The next morning, at exactly 9 a.m., Officer James Miller walked into the police station for the last time. The usual buzz of morning activity fell silent as he entered. Officers who had once been friendly now turned away, avoiding eye contact. His footsteps echoed loudly in the sudden quiet. Miller carried a cardboard box containing his personal items from his locker. His shoulders, once proud and straight, now slumped under the weight of his actions. The badge he had worn for 15 years felt heavy in his pocket. At the front desk, Linda Martinez, who had handled thousands of angry calls yesterday, watched him approach. She pushed forward a clipboard with resignation papers already prepared. "Sign here, here, and here," she said coldly, pointing at the marked spots. Her usual friendly smile was nowhere to be seen. Meanwhile, in a conference room upstairs, the police review board had gathered for an emergency session. 5 stern-faced officials sat around a large table, reviewing Miller's complete file. The evidence against him was overwhelming. "Look at this," Board Member Johnson said, holding up a report. In the past year alone, Miller used handcuffs 17 times on minorities for minor infractions. That's 3 times more than any other officer. Captain Rodriguez, again, no relation to Maria, added another disturbing detail. His dashcam footage shows he used threatening language in 80% of his stops involving minorities. This wasn't just one bad day. This was a pattern. Down the hall, internal affairs investigators were interviewing Miller's former supervisors. Lieutenant Pete Davidson, who had overseen Miller for 3 years, sat nervously in the hot seat. "Why didn't you act on these complaints?" Detective Williams asked him, spreading out file after file on the desk. Davidson's face turned red. I thought he was just being thorough. You know, strict but fair." "Strict but fair?" Williams repeated, pulling out a photo of Sophia's wrists. "Does this look fair to you?" In another room, 2 younger officers who had worked with Miller were giving their statements. Officer Sarah Chen, Tommy's aunt, finally spoke up about what she had witnessed months ago. Miller once made a teenager lie face down on hot pavement for playing music too loud. She admitted, ashamed she hadn't reported it earlier. "I wanted to say something, but I was afraid of being labeled a troublemaker." By noon, the review board had reached several decisions. 1. Miller's law enforcement certification would be permanently revoked. 2. 3 supervisors would face disciplinary action. 3. All officers would undergo immediate bias training. 4. A complete review of all past arrests would begin. At his home, Miller watched the news coverage of his downfall. Every channel showed the same things: the viral video, Sophia's tear-stained face, the angry town hall meeting. His phone kept buzzing with messages from old friends and family members, most expressing shame and disappointment. His wife had taken their children to stay with her parents. "I can't explain to our kids why their father handcuffed a child their age," her goodbye note had said. Back at the station, Chief Wilson held a press conference. Camera lights flashed as he made several announcements. Effective immediately, James Miller's law enforcement certification is permanently revoked, he stated firmly. "You will never work as a police officer again, not here, not anywhere in this country." Reporters raised their hands with questions. Will Miller face criminal charges? What about the supervisors who ignored complaints? How will this affect future police training? In the station's break room, officers watched the press conference in silence. Many thought about their own conduct, their own choices. A young rookie turned to his partner and whispered, "I joined to protect people, not to hurt kids." By late afternoon, police departments across the country were calling to learn from what happened. Miller's case was already being added to training materials as an example of what not to do. The final blow came at 4:45 p.m. when Miller's police union representative called. "I'm sorry," he said, "but we can't represent you anymore. Your actions go against everything we stand for." Miller sat alone in his living room as darkness fell. His uniform hung in the closet, never to be worn again. His badge and gun sat in evidence boxes at the station. 15 years of service had ended because of 10 minutes of poor judgment and a lifetime of unchecked bias. On his TV, Dr. Thompson was being interviewed. "This isn't just about one officer," she said. "This is about changing a system that allowed him to act this way for so long." Miller turned off the TV and sat in darkness. His career was over, but the changes he had sparked were just beginning. 2 weeks after the incident at Warren Elementary, the changes in the city's police department were already visible. The morning roll call looked different as Officer Sarah Chen stood before her fellow officers, leading a new type of briefing. "Today we're starting our mandatory de-escalation training," she announced. "And we have a special guest speaker. Dr. Karen Thompson will talk about how to interact with children in crisis situations." The room was fuller than usual. Officers from neighboring districts had come to learn from what happened. Even retired officers showed up, wanting to be part of the change. Every seat was taken, with people standing along the walls. Dr. Thompson walked in, carrying a tablet that showed the now famous video of her daughter's arrest. But today, she wasn't here as an angry mother. She was here as a teacher. "Good morning, officers," she began, her voice calm and professional. "Today, we're going to learn why a child's brain responds differently to fear than an adult's brain, and more importantly, how you can help instead of harm." In another part of the station, Detective Williams was leading a team reviewing old cases. They sat surrounded by boxes of files, checking every arrest Miller had made in his 15-year career. "Here's another one," an officer called out, holding up a yellowed report. "Miller arrested a 12-year-old for loitering outside his own house. The boy was just waiting for his mother to come home from work." Each discovery led to more changes. The department created new rules. No handcuffs on anyone under 12 except in extreme situations. 2 officers must be present when dealing with minors. Body cameras must be on during all interactions with children. Monthly reviews of all officers' conduct. Required training in child psychology. At Warren Elementary, Principal Martinez was also making changes. The school board had approved new safety guidelines. Miss Jenny, the teacher's aide who had called Officer Miller, sat in her office reviewing them. "From now on," Principal Martinez explained, "we handle playground disputes ourselves. Police are only called in true emergencies. And look, we've hired a full-time counselor specializing in children's conflict resolution." The new counselor, Ms. Jackson, had already made a difference. She had started a peace corner in every classroom where children could go to calm down and talk about their feelings. Sophia's class was the first to try it out. In the mayor's office, more changes were happening. Mayor Thompson signed new laws requiring police officers to have 40 hours of child psychology training, regular mental health checkups for all officers, a civilian review board for all complaints, body camera footage to be reviewed monthly, community engagement programs in schools. The changes spread beyond their city. Police chiefs from other states came to learn from what happened. News crews interviewed Chief Wilson about the department's transformation. "We're not just changing rules," he told reporters. "We're changing hearts and minds. Every officer now understands that authority comes with responsibility." Back at Warren Elementary, the playground had changed too. New signs showed simple rules with happy faces. Teachers had special cards in their pockets with steps to handle conflicts. The children felt safer. Sarah, the girl from the swing incident, had started a friendship club with Sophia. Every recess, they helped other kids solve problems without fighting. Their club became so popular that other schools wanted to copy it. Maria Rodriguez's video was now being used in police academies across the country. But it wasn't shown to shame officers, it was used to teach them how to do better. She had turned down many offers to sell the footage, instead donating it to police training programs. The old school resource officer had been replaced by Officer Chen, Tommy's aunt. She never wore her full uniform in school, instead choosing a friendly polo shirt with a small badge. She spent more time playing basketball with kids than patrolling hallways. 1 month after the incident, Dr. Thompson stood in front of the school board. Behind her sat parents, teachers, and police officers, all working together now. "Look how far we've come," she said, pointing to a presentation showing all the changes. "But we're not done yet. This is just the beginning." In the audience, Sophia sat next to Sarah, both wearing Peace Leader badges. They had helped design the new playground rules themselves. Their motto was simple: be kind first, ask questions later. The system was changing, one rule at a time, one heart at a time. What started with 10 minutes of poor judgment had turned into a movement for positive change that would help children for years to come. 6 months after the playground incident, Sophia Thompson stood at a small podium in front of the National Police Chiefs Convention. Her yellow hair ribbons matched her bright dress, and her voice was clear and confident as she spoke to hundreds of police officers. My name is Sophia, and I'm 6 years old now, she began. I want to tell you about the day that changed everything, and why it's important to be kind to kids like me. The room fell silent as everyone listened to this brave little girl. In the audience, Dr. Thompson watched proudly as her daughter shared her story. Next to her sat Maria Rodriguez, whose viral video was now part of standard police training across America. After what happened, Sophie continued, "My friend Sarah and I started the Kindness First program. Now over 50 schools use our ideas." She held up a colorful handbook that she and Sarah had helped create with their teachers. The handbook, titled Kids and Cops, Building Trust Together, had simple but powerful messages. Always try talking first. Everyone makes mistakes. Big problems start small. Kindness works better than fear. Help instead of hurt. Back in their city, the changes had grown even stronger. The police department had become a national model for reform. Officers now wore special pins that said "Child-Friendly Officer" after completing their training. Former Officer Miller's case was now studied in law schools and police academies. But not just as a warning. It was also taught as a story of how communities could come together and create positive change. Miller himself had found a new purpose. After months of counseling and self-reflection, he started speaking at police training sessions, sharing his mistakes so others wouldn't repeat them. "I thought I was teaching respect through fear," he told a group of new recruits. "But all I did was teach children to fear those who should protect them. Don't make my mistakes." At Warren Elementary, the playground had become a model for other schools. The Peace Corner idea had spread to over 100 schools nationwide. Sarah and Sophia's Friendship Club had chapters in 3 different states. Principal Martinez now gave talks at education conferences about how to handle school conflicts. "We learned that every problem has a story behind it," she would say. "Our job is to listen to that story, not punish before we understand." Dr. Thompson had created a new program at her hospital called Healing Hearts and Minds, offering free counseling to children who had traumatic experiences with authority figures. The program had already helped hundreds of families. Maria Rodriguez's video had reached over 20 million views, but more importantly, it had sparked similar citizen journalism efforts across the country. People felt more empowered to document and report abuse of power. Officer Sarah Chen, who had led many of the new training programs, was now the head of a new youth relations division. Her office walls were covered with drawings from children who saw her as a friend, not someone to fear. The mayor had just signed a new law named after Sophia. The Thompson Act required all cities in the state to adopt child-friendly police policies. Other states were starting to follow their example. In the convention hall, Sophia finished her speech with words that brought tears to many eyes. "My mommy says that bad things can lead to good changes if we learn from them. I was scared that day, but now I'm brave because I helped make things better." The entire room stood and applauded. Police chiefs from across the country lined up to shake her small hand and get copies of the handbook she and Sarah had helped create. Later that evening, at a special dinner, Sophia sat between Sarah and Tommy. The 3 friends who had been part of that difficult day were now leaders in their own way. Sophia spoke to police about understanding children. Sarah taught other kids about telling the truth even when scared. Tommy showed how accidents don't have to turn into big problems. Dr. Thompson looked around the room, seeing how much had changed in 6 months. Police officers playing games with children. Teachers and cops working together. Parents trusting authorities again. Children feeling safe to make mistakes and learn from them. The last photo taken that night showed Sophia giving a high five to a smiling police officer while wearing her Peace Leader badge. This photo would later hang in police stations across the country with a simple caption, "Remember why we serve." What started as 10 minutes of poor judgment had transformed into a lifetime of positive change. Sophia's story had taught everyone an important lesson. Sometimes the smallest voices can create the biggest changes.